Over the next 7 weeks, we'll be walking through the final weeks of Jesus' life by looking at a series of events that culminated with the greatest event in all of human history. Everything from Jesus descending into hell, the triumphal entry, crucifixion, resurrection, and everything in between. Join us in person or online as we journey through Jesus' final days on earth and why we're still talking about it nearly 2,000 years later.
Well, welcome to Meck's online campus. We are in a series on the final week of Jesus' life, a period of time known as the Passion or the ordeal of his crucifixion. But there was more to his last week than that, a lot more. There was conflict and confrontations. There were betrayals and beatings. There were visits to the temple and even visits to Hades. Last week, we kicked it off with how the week itself got kicked off with his entry into Jerusalem, a day known as Palm Sunday, which sounds peaceful and tranquil and tame, and we found out it was anything but. It was an announcement. It was a declaration that not only was Jesus the Messiah, but a Messiah unlike anything or anyone that they had been expecting. Today, we're going to look at what happened after he entered the city and find out that however he may have entered, he was just warming up. Now, before we get into that, let's remind ourselves a little bit of review about why Jesus coming to Jerusalem at the end of his 3-year run of public ministry was such a big deal. The setup, if you will, for this whole last week of events. Why was coming to Jerusalem such a catalyst for so many different things? Well, there were 3 reasons. The first reason is because it was the first time Jesus had visited Jerusalem since he began his public ministry. See, even those who weren't sure about who Jesus was knew that this would be something of enormous significance. Here was a man who was working miracles and raising the dead and giving these radical teachings and causing thousands upon thousands to follow him. People were thinking and hoping and calling for him to just lead the nation, just declare independence from Rome, set up a new dynasty. And now he was coming to the most holy of cities, the place of the great temple, the heart of the Jewish faith, as well as the heart of the Jewish people. If he was going to do anything as a Jewish leader for the Jewish people, lead anything, declare himself to be anything, be crowned anything, it would be here. So that's first. Another reason this was big was because the city was already in adrenaline overdrive because it was the Passover, which is the most celebrated of all the Jewish events. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of pilgrims would be filling its streets, filling it with religious energy. The Passover, which was a celebration of what God did through Moses in leading the Jewish people out of bondage from Egypt through 10 plagues and the parting of the seas, is a legendary story. It was the festival of festivals. Think Mardi Gras in New Orleans or what happened in Vegas with Super Bowl last weekend. In fact, as we talked about last weekend, over 300,000 people went to Vegas because of the game. The Jewish historian Josephus writes that on one occasion, over 2.5 million people came to Jerusalem for the Passover. So like 8 times as many. And then finally, those closest to Jesus knew that this would be the climax of his ministry. He had been telling them all along that everything he was doing, everything he was teaching, everything he was about was moving toward Jerusalem. Take a look at how this is charted in Luke's biography of Jesus alone. In Luke chapter 9, he says, as the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. Luke chapter 10, Jesus and the disciples continued on their way to Jerusalem. Chapter 13, Jesus went through the towns and villages, teaching as he went, always pressing on toward Jerusalem. And then in chapter 18, Jesus made it clear that when he got there, it was not going to be like everybody thought. It was going to be a climactic series of events that would shock everybody. This is what he said. Taking the 12 disciples aside, Jesus said, listen, we are going up to Jerusalem, where all the predictions of the prophets concerning the Son of Man will come true. He'll be handed over to the Romans, and he'll be mocked and treated shamefully and spit upon. They will flog him with a whip and kill him, but on the 3rd day, he will rise again. So that's why this was a big deal. Jesus had been moving toward Jerusalem his entire life. It was where his life mission would be fulfilled. Everything that began with an angel announcing to a virgin named Mary that she would have a son was culminating here and culminating now. So what was the first thing Jesus did when he got there? Well, I teased last week that after he came riding in on the back of an ass, he went straight to the temple and started kicking some. It wasn't a tease. That's pretty much what he did. This is how Mark's biography of Jesus records the event, but it's also recorded in every other biographical account of the life of Jesus. On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple area and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, 'My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers." Now, before we get into the specifics of that, let's clear something up. What does this tell us about the kind of person Jesus was? You see, if you're like most people, you're going to think about Jesus in probably at least one of two ways. People tend to fall into one of two camps. The first camp sees Jesus as kind and gentle and soft-spoken and mild-mannered, kind of like this guy. This is the Jesus that never raises his voice, never gets mad or angry. This is the Jesus that wants to be your neighbor. It's a nice Jesus. It's a good Jesus, a Jesus full of grace. But then there's a second camp that sees Jesus a little differently than Mr. Rogers. This camp sees Jesus as strong and muscular, a man's man, willing to fight and to go to war, someone who stands against injustice and stands for freedom, kind of like this guy. This is the Jesus who walks through the world kicking butt and taking names. If the first Jesus is full of grace, this one is full of truth. So which one is Jesus? Is he Mr. Rogers or is he Braveheart? Well, what if the answer is yes? What if he's a mix of both? Well, he was. In fact, that's how he was described. Here's how it's put in John's biography. It says, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." It reminds me of how C.S. Lewis described the great Aslan in the Chronicles of Narnia, the great lion. If you haven't read those books, oh my goodness, you got to start at once. They are classics and so much better than the films. If all you saw were the films, no. Read the books. They tell of 4 children who enter a magic wardrobe and through that into a land called Narnia, where animals talk and all kinds of wonderful magic and adventure awaits. It's also a bit of an allegory, with Aslan, the lion, representing Jesus. I want you to listen to how he is described to the 4 children when they first enter Narnia and they learn about his existence from Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. Lucy asks, is he a man? "Aslan, a man," said Mr. Beaver sternly. "Certainly not. I tell you, he is the king of the wood and the son of the great emperor beyond the sea. Don't you know who is the king of beasts? Aslan is a lion, the great lion." "Oh," said Susan, "I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion." "That you will, dearie, and no mistake," said Mrs. Beaver. "If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or else just silly." "Then he isn't safe?" asked Lucy. "Safe?" said Mr. Beaver. "Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you." That's a deep truth. Jesus is good, but he's not necessarily safe. Today we're going to dig into the side of him that might be a little bit more on the William Wallace side of things, where he was very good, but anyone there that day would never have called him safe. Now let's start off talking, though, about the temple itself. The temple was the center of Israel's worship and was viewed as the very dwelling place of God. This is so important to understand what Jesus did. It started as a tent or a tabernacle in the wilderness in the days of Moses. The temple itself, the stone temple, was first built in Jerusalem by Solomon. It was reconstructed during the time of Haggai and later expanded by King Herod. It's already way too much history than you wanted to know, but let me keep going. It was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70, and parts of it, though, still survive. In fact, if you have ever heard of the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, that's the last surviving part of the temple from Jesus' day, which is why it is so revered. Here's what it looks like. During Jesus' day, the temple was where you met with God. Human beings would approach with sacrifices, and God would respond with forgiveness and answered prayers. So what did Jesus do when he got there? Well, he cleaned it up and cleared it out, and it needed it. Now, here's what was going on. People who came to Jerusalem for the Passover feast needed animals that met the ritual sacrifices, ritual requirements for sacrifice. These were really faithful, good people, devout pilgrims. Because they had to travel a great distance often to get there, they would often buy the temples they needed once they got to the city. Vendors, as a result, would set up animal pens as well as money-changing tables because the pilgrims not only needed to buy animals, but they would give a monetary gift to the temple and the work of God. In other words, this was the time when they not only gave their sacrifice, but they also gave their gift, their monetary gift to the temple and the work of God. In other words, this was the time that they would bring their tithe, a word that means 10%, a reference to taking 10% of all that you earned and give it to the work of the Lord, which was to the temple. But to do any of those things, they needed local currency. So they would also need to find, again, a money changer. Nothing wrong with that. There were markets set up all over the nearby Mount of Olives to serve that need with integrity. But what happened was this. A group of unscrupulous people set up shop to try and take advantage of this, particularly of the poor. And they did it by charging exorbitant rates. We know that they were targeting the poor because the selling of doves is what is most frequently mentioned, which was the sacrifice most often given by the poorest of the poor because they couldn't afford what was considered the better offering, which was a sheep. So they were preying on the poor's piety, preying on their devotion, and trying to get as much money from these dear souls as they possibly could. But that's not all. See, they were doing it in the temple itself, and specifically in the first or outer court, which was the place set aside for all people, Jew or Gentile, men and women, for worship and prayer. Now, this is so critical to understand. Let me show you how the temple was laid out. As you can see here, there were two courts, an outer court and then an inner court. The outer court encircled the inner court. The inner court wasn't open to just anybody. It was only for those who had already committed themselves to the faith. This is where you had such things as the holy place with the altar of incense. And beyond that, you had the Holy of Holies, which one originally built by Solomon held the Ark of the Covenant. But the outer court was for everybody. Everyone interested in what the temple represented, which was finding God and connecting with God. It was open to Jew. It was open to Gentile. Anybody could pray and enter and walk through it. In fact, that's what it was designed for. That was its purpose. It was where people far from God could come and get right with God. But that's where the money changers and animal sellers set up shop. That's the space they took over. So this was more than just trying to take advantage of making money off of people's faith. This was more than crass commercialism. The front door to God had been closed to those in most need of it being open. It was even being used as a cut-through street for people bringing in deliveries to the city. It had become polluted. It had become defiled. Anything but a place reflective of God. And to Jesus, the entire affair just made a mockery of not only the temple, but the heart of God toward people who were far from him. In fact, it showed disdain for those who were apart from God. I mean, you just have to enter into and think about how it must have impacted him. When he saw this, Jesus, who cared more about lost people and people far from God than any of us could possibly imagine. The Jesus who said, "Who needs a doctor? The healthy or the sick? I'm here inviting outsiders, not insiders, an invitation to a changed life, changed inside and out." The one who said, "Your Father in heaven doesn't want to lose even one." The Jesus who said, "I came to seek and to save the lost." Imagine Jesus, that Jesus, going to the temple and seeing the The one area, the one place designed for people to find God, where they were supposed to be welcomed to find God, encouraged to reflect and pray and explore, the place set aside to seek after God and finding it filled with noise and corruption and animals and feces and carts and cut-throughs and buying and selling and extortion and greed. People weren't finding God. They were being driven away from God. This had to punch every button Jesus had. So what did Jesus do? Well, the knee-jerk assessment of most is that he got physical, even violent. And that's partly true. He did get physical. John, in his biography, even adds the detail that he made a whip of cords to drive people out, or at least to drive the animals out. But the heart of his response wasn't physical. The heart of his reaction was moral outrage. And here was the essence of his moral outrage. And he even said as much. You've made this a den of robbers. Now that's interesting. There are two ways the Bible talks about people robbing God. Just two. And then obviously it being condemned. The first is when it comes to how God has given us everything that we have financially and asks for us to be generous in return with that tithe, that 10% gift. When we don't give back to God out of all that he's given to us, he calls us robbers. That we're literally robbing him. That matters to God because that money, that was his to begin with, that was meant to fund the ministry of his work. And when it's not being given, that means that the temple, the local church of our day, the hungry aren't being fed, the naked aren't being clothed, the homeless aren't housed, the widows and orphans aren't being protected. Every ministry birthed from the heart of God, wanting to be championed by God, runs dry. It's serious to rob God that way. Then there is this situation where Jesus says that they have turned the house of God into a robber's den. This wasn't about money. As much as driving out the money changers may make us feel that this was all about money, it wasn't about what they were doing. It was about where they were doing it, because they were doing it in the outer court, the place designed for people to come to God and find God and meet God. It was a place where God was trying to reach people. And this wasn't reaching people. It was turning them off, turning them away, preventing them from coming and finding the God they so desperately needed. Notice the language. Jesus said, "Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer," this is key, "for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." Did you catch it? It was supposed to be a place for all nations, all people, men and women, Jew and Gentile, to find God. But instead, they'd made it a den of robbers. And what were they robbing? This time, they were not robbing God of his money. They were robbing God of his people. They were robbing God of reaching the nations. So Jesus responded exactly like you think he would, with moral outrage. In fact, the original Greek word used for driving everyone out was the same strong word used for exorcisms, for driving out demons. That's how evil Jesus perceived this to be. This was how spiritually elevated and full of testosterone this moment was. And the power of that moral outrage was just palpable. Did you notice what the people did when Jesus began driving everybody out? Overturning the tables of the money changers, overturning the benches of those selling doves, and wouldn't allow anyone to carry merchandise through the court. Did you catch what everybody did? They did nothing. They said nothing. They couldn't because they knew Jesus was right. They could only meet what he did with silence, conviction, or simmering resentment. But how should we meet it? How should we react to what Jesus did? What should it mean to us? Because this is an event in the life of Jesus for every one of us, no matter where we stand. And each of us stands in one of two places. We're either in the inner court or we're in the outer court. We're either believing or not believing. We're filled with faith or we are filled with questions. We've found the truth or we're still seeking after the truth. So let's see what this means for wherever we're standing, beginning with what it means for us inner court folks. Those of us who would say, well, we're Team Jesus. How are we doing with the outer court? Because while we're standing in the inner court, the outer court is the responsibility of those who are in the inner court. Inner court people are supposed to be all about caring for outer court people and making sure that the outer court stays open. And not just open, but that it's still functioning the way an outer court should be functioning, which is fulfilling the purpose and mission of an outer court. Inner court people are supposed to be on mission to outer court people. So what would Jesus see? What would Jesus say and do today? Would he see that we're all about the outer court, or that we become all about ourselves, not just turned inner court, but inward? It reminds me of something I once read, how in the late 1940s, the United States government commissioned an $80 million troop carrier for the Navy. The purpose was to design a ship that could speedily carry 15,000 battle-ready troops to the heart of any conflict during times of war. By 1952, construction of what would be named the SS United States was complete. The ship could travel at 44 knots, which is like 51 miles an hour, which is very fast, and could steam 10,000 miles without stopping for fuel or supplies. She could outrun any other ship, travel nonstop anywhere in the world in less than 10 days. She was the fastest, most reliable troop carrier in the world, integral to any mission that there could be. The only problem is that she never ended up carrying any troops anywhere. Instead, she became a luxury liner for presidents, heads of state, a variety of other celebrities who traveled on her during her 17 years of service. Transitioned to a luxury liner, she couldn't carry 15,000 people. She could only house a little under 2,000 passengers who would enjoy the luxuries of 695 staterooms and 4 dining salons and 3 bars and 2 theaters and 5 acres of open deck with heated pools and 19 elevators and the comfort of the world's first fully air-conditioned passenger ship. Instead of a vessel used for a battle during wartime, the SS United States became a means of indulgence for wealthy patrons who desired to coast peacefully across the Atlantic. Now think about the difference between what that ship was originally designed for and what it became. Things look radically different on a luxury liner than they do a troop carrier. The faces of soldiers preparing for battle and those of patrons enjoying their bonbons are radically different, and they have radically different missions. The troop carrier has an urgent task to accomplish. The luxury liner, it's all about the passengers. You know, it's so interesting. What started off with a mission to the outer court became all about the inner court. But that's not all that can happen. How can you be on mission if you don't even know there's a mission? I mean, even that can be forgotten. I mean, forget that you were once all about, the outer court. What if you're just reached that point where you even forgot there was even supposed to be an outer court? Fred Craddock tells a story about the first church he ever pastored. It was a small church in the hills of East Tennessee near Oak Ridge. And because of the huge facility, I don't know if you've seen the movie Oppenheimer, but because of the huge facility built at Oak Ridge where the materials for the Manhattan nuclear project were developed, this little sleepy country church suddenly found itself in the midst of this booming population. The town became filled with temporary workers living in RVs and tents and makeshift shelters all over the area. And here in the middle of it was this little 112-year-old church. Craddock saw it as this wonderful opportunity to reach out. So after church one Sunday, he told the leaders he wanted to start a campaign to invite all these workers into the church. And then he began to hear it. I don't think they'd fit in. I mean, are we sure that they're like our type? I mean, what kind of people are they anyway? They're only temporary. They don't have houses or own property or anything. Well, they decided to take a vote the next Sunday. Yes, a vote on whether to invite people to attend. The day came, and the first thing that happened was a motion was made that in order to be a member of the church, you had to own property in the county. It was seconded and passed, and that ended that. Years later, Craddock went to find that church that had given him that painful memory. He wanted to show his wife the first church he had ever pastored. And he found the church building, but it was different. I mean, the parking lot was full of cars, RVs and vans and motorcycles and trailers and a bus or two. And then he noticed the sign out front, barbecue, all you can eat. The church had died. It had become a restaurant. Craddock turned to his wife and he said, well, good thing this still isn't a church, else all those people couldn't even be in there. Oh, there's so much in this for us inner court folks. But there's something here for outer court folks as well. Let me give you your headline. When God designed the temple, he designed everything around it to be for you, to serve you in your search, in your exploration, so that you could come, you would come. You see, when the church is being the church, when it's reflecting Jesus' heart toward you, when it's been cleaned up and cleared out, that is when an outer court truly encircles it. Someone sent me something about how one church decided to make this as clear as possible. Here's what they had written that they would had posted, what they would give to people or in their program or whatever. And it said, we extend a special welcome to those who are single, married, divorced, filthy rich, dirt poor, yo no habla inglés. You're welcome here if you're just browsing, just woke up, or just got out of jail. We welcome soccer moms, NASCAR dads, starving artists, tree huggers, latte sippers, vegetarians, junk food eaters. We welcome those who are in recovery or still addicted. We welcome you if you're having problems or you're down in the dumps or if you don't like organized religion. If you blew all your money at the dog track, you're welcome here. We welcome those who are inked, pierced, both. We offer a special welcome to those who could use a prayer right now, had religion shoved down your throat as a kid, or got lost in traffic and wound up here by mistake. We welcome seekers and doubters. We welcome you. That's an outer court church. But that's the way it's meant to be, because we have an outer court kind of God. And if that hasn't been made clear to you before now, I am so, so sorry. It just tells me that you've run into a few temples that really needed Jesus to show up and clean them out. But some have been cleaned out, willingly, wantingly, purposefully, self-cleaned. There are places that get it and get you. I know that that's our heart here. I hope you see how open the outer court is here at Meck. And I do mean open. And if you wonder, well, what do you mean? Is it really open? One of my favorite stories on how this should play out and how I think it does play out comes from a man I know by the name of Tony. He was a pastor, and he went to Honolulu for a trip. And when he arrived, he experienced the difficulty of the time change that is involved. When you go there straight from the States, 3 o'clock in the morning feels like 9 o'clock in the morning. So one morning he was up at about 3:30 looking for a place to eat. And he found a little place up a side street that was open, and he went into what deserved to be called a greasy spoon. So there he sat, sipping some coffee at 3 in the morning, when all of a sudden the door to the diner just burst open and in marched 8 or 9 prostitutes. It was a small place, so they kind of surrounded him, sitting on either side, and their talk was loud and crude. And just as he was getting ready to make a quick exit, because he felt awkward, he heard one of the girls say that tomorrow was her birthday. She was going to be 39. Her friends started to say, "Oh, what do you want from us? You want a birthday party? You want a cake? You want us to get a cake and sing you happy birthday? Is that what you want?" And she said, "Come on, just get off my back. I'm just saying tomorrow's my birthday. I don't want anything from you. I mean, why should you give me a birthday party? I've never had a birthday party my whole life." When Tony heard that, he made a decision. He waited for the girls to leave, and then he leaned over to the big guy who was behind the counter, and he said, "Hey, do they come in here every night?" And he said, "Yeah, every night." He said, "What about the one that sat right next to me, the one who said her birthday is tomorrow? Does she come in every night?" He said, "Yeah, that's Agnes. She comes in here every night." And he said, "Why do you want to know?" Kind of protective over the girls. Tony said, "Look, what do you say you and I do something for her birthday? What about us throwing a birthday party for her right here tomorrow night?" And the big guy looked at him for a minute, and he went, "I think that's great. I like it." And then he says, "Agnes is one of those people who's really nice and kind, and nobody ever does anything nice and kind for her." So at 2:30 the next morning, Tony was back at the diner. He picked up some crepe paper at the store. He made this great big sign out of cardboard that said, "Happy birthday, Agnes." He had that place decorated from one end to the other, and somebody must have gotten word out on the street, because by 3:15, every prostitute in Honolulu he felt was there. It was wall-to-wall prostitutes with my minister friend in the middle. At 3:30 on the dot, the door of the diner swung open, and in came Agnes. Tony had everybody ready, and when she came in, the whole place screamed, "Happy birthday!" And Agnes just stood there. She was absolutely stunned. I mean, her mouth just fell open, her legs started to buckle, her eyes began to moisten. And when the cake was carried out with all the candles lit, she just lost it. She broke down in tears. And the big guy behind the counter said, "Blow out the candles, Agnes, come on, blow them out." And so she blew out the candles. And then he handed her a knife, told her to cut the cake. And Agnes looked at the cake, and then without taking her eyes off of it, she just very softly said, "Is it all right with you if I just keep the cake a little while? I mean, is it all right if we don't eat it right now?" And the big guy said, "I mean, sure. I mean, it's your cake, and you can even take it home if you want to." And she said, "Can I? Can I take it home?" And then looking at Tony, she said, "I just live down the street a couple of doors. I'd love to take this cake home. Can I just take it home? I'll be right back. I promise I'll be right back." So she got off the stool, she picked up the cake, and carrying it like a newborn baby, she walked slowly out toward the door. And everyone just stood there without saying a word. And when the door closed, this stunned silence fell on the restaurant. Because what do we do now? This was supposed to be a party. She took the cake and took it home. And not knowing what else to do, Tony said he just said the first thing that came into his mind. He said, "What do you say we pray?" So there he sat, a pastor leading a prayer meeting with a bunch of prostitutes in a diner in Honolulu at 3:30 in the morning. And he said he prayed for Agnes. He prayed for her salvation. He prayed that her life would change and that God would be good to her. And then he just said, "Amen." When he finished, the big guy, whose name was Harry, leaned over the counter and said, "Hey, you didn't tell me you were a preacher. What kind of preacher are you anyway?" And before he could stop himself, he said, "Well, I guess I'm the kind that throws birthday parties for prostitutes at 3:30 in the morning." And the big guy behind the counter didn't even laugh. He said, "No." He said, "No, you aren't. There's no church like that. If there was," he said, "I'd join it, but there's no church like that. But if there was, I'd join a church like that." Wouldn't we all? Well, there are churches like that. And I'd like to officially welcome you into one. Because there is a God like that. A God of outer courts. For prostitutes in diners at 3:30 in the morning. And for you. Right here. Right now. All right. Well, let me pray for you. Father, thank you so much for being that kind of God who loves us that much and meets us with not just truth, but also grace. And what got Jesus so exercised that day was his compassion and heart for those who are far from you. We just don't have many people fighting for us, but you do. You do. So thank you. And we just say that in Jesus' name. We pray it to you in his name. Amen.